Hello and welcome along to Classeek 15, the podcast hub of insider advice on how to break into and make a career in classical music. I'm Jack Pepper, I'm a composer and radio presenter, and I'm inviting you to these 15-minute long virtual coffees with classical stars and insiders. Today, we're digging inside music journalism, recorded music and gramophone. It's a magazine I have the pleasure of writing for. I've curated their last two global season previews. I wrote their official tribute to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And I've curated many an eclectic online playlist for their website. Today we are meeting the editor and publisher of Gramophone, Martin Cullingford. Now, in addition to looking after Gramophone, he's also the publisher of International Piano, Choir and Organ, Opera Now and Musicals magazine. We caught up on a video call, and I began by asking Martin an impossible question. Could he take us inside a typical day in his diary?
A rather wonderful way to answer that is that there simply isn't one, which is probably an obvious question, an obvious answer that many people will give. But the cycle of a magazine that is a monthly magazine like Gramophone, once upon a time, would have followed a fairly set format of if you begin a month by working on the copy that you pre-commissioned as an arrived, you lay out pages, a month later you send it to press. But there's been such profound changes in the way that classical music media works that nowadays I will be doing some of that, but I will also be editing or recording a podcast. I'll be working with the online team. And also quite a big part of my job as the publisher of the title, and actually the publisher of other classical music titles too, is also to be involved in the budgets, the planning, the making the business work so that we can be successful titles sharing the writing and content about music.
And what does that success, that landscape look like now? You touch on how this is a multifaceted role, but it's a multifaceted world as well. It's not just a print magazine now. So what does that landscape look like for you in terms of a publisher?
You're absolutely right. I mean, 20 years ago, actually slightly more than that, when I started at Gramophone, we produced a magazine which landed on someone's doormat once a month. But nowadays, that is still crucial. And in fact, last year we had a slight increase in our circulation, which is absolutely wonderful. Although interestingly, that's both print, of course, now, but also a digital edition, a page turner magazine on iPad or other tablets. But that's part of what we do. We also have a very successful podcast stream. Every week we talk to an artist or perhaps have a conversation ourselves. That reaches very different people, but potentially some of the same people. We also work really hard in thinking about the role of online content, features that might reach out to someone for whom Gramophone might feel too specialist, but actually has a real appetite for that informed and enthusiastic writing about music that perhaps the website can bring them in a different sort of way. So the landscape is very different to what it was, but it's hugely exciting. What
would you say is the toughest part of your job now, the thing that you struggle with the most?
In terms of toughness, if by that what you really mean is which is the bit that causes me the most focus and to put a positive spin on it, often deciding what you can't cover is a really depressing thing, but that's a reflection of just what an extraordinary amount of recording activity there is in this day and age. The challenge that I have, that's the biggest challenge, is always thinking, how does a brand like Gramophone, and I use the word brand to encompass everything we've been talking about, how does a brand like Gramophone relate to an ever-changing audience for classical music? And some of those people will be wanting to buy a magazine and engage with print in that way. Some people will be buying traditional albums, but some people will be listening to albums released as EPs on streaming services. They'll be watching online videos. They might be watching something in an orchestra's concert hall. And all of those are very legitimate ways of organizations making music, reaching audiences with music. But it has profoundly changed the nature of what is a recording now. And as a magazine and a website and podcast and so on, I'm always thinking to myself, how can we both serve the audience that we've had for a long time and want to keep serving as best as we can, but how can we also make us relevant and important to that ever-changing demographic? So it is a challenge, but it's a hugely exciting challenge, because actually to have the position of knowing there's an audience out there that you can reach in different ways and for different reasons is a really wonderful thing.
And what kind of skill set do you need to be able to do that? You know, what should a good editor be? What kind of qualities should a good editor have?
Goodness, well, like others, I'd be the judge of that. But if people are thinking of pursuing this as a career, despite all I've said, the very nature of what it is to be a journalist hasn't changed, which is to have a passion for and a sense of what makes for a great story, and to want to communicate that to an audience in the broadest possible term, whether that's a reader or listener or whatever it is. And that is as true as when someone was writing for the early newspapers centuries ago as it is now when thinking about what's going to work on a podcast. And obviously all of those mediums succeed in different sorts of ways, but ultimately what makes a story, what is a story? And you'll know, Jack, when we've talked about things in the past, my question is always, what is the story behind this? Why is it exciting the person who's doing it? And how can I communicate that to an audience?
So was it a long-held ambition of yours? Was the child Martin Cullingford going, I want to be a music journalist? Were you reading Gramophone? What were your ambitions?
My reach into journalism, into the kind of journalism I have, is it was in part a mixture of wanting to be a journalist and part a mixture of a love of music. I did play music as a teenager. I played the clarinet in the school orchestra and went for a bit to a Saturday morning music school and was in two marching bands, one on the clarinet, one on the drums, which I think left me with a much better sense of rhythm than I might otherwise have had. But when I was in sixth form, I started writing for my local newspaper, the Lowestoft Journal. I became a theatre reviewer for them and ended up editing their music page. At university, I did an internship at the Times, which led to freelance work. And then after graduating, I began life as a financial journalist. But music, as I've described, is an absolute love of mine. And Gramophone was looking for an experienced journalist who loved music to combine those two things and to join them. And so it wasn't so much a burning passion to be a music journalist that got me where it was. It was a love of music and a desire to be a journalist. And the two blended absolutely wonderfully in my early 20s, which was a long time ago. But from all of that, I would advise people, if they're thinking of this as a career, to always be aware of, pursue wider opportunities if they're there. Show what you can do in any field which touches on what your ultimate ambition might be. Because actually, when we're looking to recruit, we're very open to the notion of a transferable skill. We're looking for people to demonstrate how they've been able to apply their passion and their skill and their knowledge to whatever they've been doing up until this point.
It's a very good point, because actually not only is it a very crowded space in terms of artists and new releases being sent your way trying to catch your attention, but actually from a writer's point of view, you have a very established stable of writers and critics who you've worked with for years, and you yourself have a very long relationship with Gramophone. So what is it that catches your eye? I'll ask you this question about artists in a moment, but in a writer, first of all, what is it that could open that door to such a sort of an established stable of writers? What is it that would catch your eye in a writer, first of all?
So I deal with that in terms of two types of writing. If we think of our reviews, there we're looking for an expert who has listened extensively at great length to so much music, understands that so intimately that they can then communicate what it is they're hearing in a particular performance, aware of course that it's an art, not a science, but can communicate their own opinion but also draw on their knowledge. So that's one side of it. But a lot of music journalism is also, I guess, what we would describe as features, interviews, and what I'm looking for there is someone who, again, I return to that notion of a story, someone who has detected in what an artist is doing something that is profoundly interesting, that actually will help engage people with the notion of what it is to be a musician, to make music. I'm looking for someone who's aware of the story and then frankly able to tell that story in a compelling fashion, whether that's with words, whether that's through an interview on a podcast. The skill of a journalist, but also just that nose for a story. But ultimately, at the end of the day, a complete love and passion for the subject and a desire to communicate it to as many people as possible.
And how does that reflect itself with artists then? What would catch your ear if you were being sent a recording by a musician, say, or and maybe it's a debut album? What would catch your ear and your eye in a young up and coming artist?
In a young and up and coming artist, I mean, dealing first with those who are established, of course, to a certain extent, they've already established a track record, so we will be interested in what they are doing and why. But from a young and new artist, first and foremost, superb musicianship. That goes without saying. We're looking for that next generation of people who are going to be the musical stars of the future. But then there are a lot of those. How do we distinguish between those? And for me, again, I'm looking for someone who can communicate a notion of why they feel this music needs to be played and recorded. Why have they chosen to perform this particular music? What do they have to say about it? And sometimes that can be a program that by its very nature grabs the attention. It could be repertoire that we haven't heard, but they feel we should hear and can explain to us why that should be the case. It might be a program which draws interesting links between works that we do know. All of those things are brilliant. They show a creative mind in action. But ultimately, it's someone who, through their music making, can make us think slightly differently about either music we didn't know or music in general by introducing us new works.
And how important is the affiliation with, say, a major record label? You know, how important is that big record deal for, you know, a music journalist versus, say, small independents or even artists on their own? How important is that sort of wider relationship?
A relationship with a major label still means a lot. And I don't mean just to me, but to the wider world. Someone at some point has taken a big decision on an artist from an A&R perspective and is backing them with a label's reputation and you know, a lot of marketing reach and all goes into making recordings. So it is important, but the notion of how a major relates to other labels is quite different, I think, to what it was only decades ago. We use the word independent because it's a useful distinction between the likes of Decca, Deutsche Grammophon, and then labels like Hyperion, Chandos, etc. But actually, those labels that we would once have called independents are extraordinary entities whose recordings stand right at the top of so many lists of works and of albums. So in a way, if we're talking about label in the general sense, it is still that notion of a organization has, say, taken that step to support an artist, to say to us, this artist is meaningful for this particular reason. In terms of self-releasing, it's an absolutely valid way of making a record. It's an absolutely superb way of getting music out there. It increasingly can be almost something that people won't notice if that recording gets itself into playlists or can be shared on social media. But it is a harder starting point, I think, for an artist, just because they are then having to do the work of persuading people to listen to their album, to want to be part of the story of telling it and sharing it. So it's part of the ecosystem, but being on a label, it's a bit of a calling card still, and it's not an unimportant one. You also, by doing that, drawing on the heritage and skill and awareness of so many extraordinary sound engineers and producers, which are all part of those label environments.
So what would be your golden nugget of wisdom then to a young person listening, that maybe when you look back at you when you were starting out, the thing you didn't understand that you wish you did, what would be, if you're setting the record straight, if you pardon the pun, what would you say is the most important thing for a young person looking to, whether it's to be a music journalist or to be a player, a performer, what's the most important thing for them to keep in mind?
So starting, I think, with being a journalist, I think the most important thing is it's a wonderful career, but it's quite a tough and competitive one, but a wonderful thing. So just be very aware of why do you have a passion to do this? Ask yourself that question. What is it that makes me feel this is the world I would like to work in? And if you can answer that in a positive way, then you will have a wonderful career and it will be extraordinarily exciting. But all the time, ask yourself at every single level of what you're doing, when you're thinking about what you might want to write or pitch or propose or who you want to talk to, why does this story need to be told? Why am I excited about it? And what's the best way of communicating that excitement to other people? Have a very open, broad mind as to what it is that you might want to write about, and constantly challenge yourself. Because if you're allowing yourself to have your preconceptions challenged, then you will be a better writer, thinker, listener, and that will come across in everything that you write. As regards being an artist, obviously I'm thinking specifically from the recording perspective, and my question would always be, ask yourself, because this is the question I will always ask of an album and ask of an artist, why does this record need to be made? What is it that you want to achieve by doing this? What is your burning passion with this record that you want to communicate to someone who's going to devote time and energy to listening? How do you want to impact and change their life? And if you can answer that in a positive way with your music making, with your programming, then you're halfway there to doing exactly those things for that listener.
Martin Cullingford, thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Jack. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you for joining us. I hope we can meet again for another Classeek 15 very soon. The whole series is available on the usual podcast platforms and online at classeek.com. There you'll also find all of Classeek's news, opportunities, their online concert series and video on demand. And whilst you are online, do follow @Classeek Music on social media to have the very latest updates. Thanks for joining me, Jack Pepper, and I hope we get to chat again soon.